Hello A peers, this is a quick rundown of our most recent class. We talked about voting turnout and voting trends. A little recap of that lecture for you. At the beginning I asked you to brainstorm who you thought made up the coalition of Obama voters and Romney voters. And that's kind of the premise we want to take when we start to tackle this stuff and look at different voting trends. In general, the United States has pretty low voter turnout, specifically on midterm elections, which recall that is when there's an even year election but is not a presidential election. So typically you'll see all House members will go for re-election in midterm elections, and then a third of the Senate. On presidential election years, typically we're looking, as you see in the chart, about 60 or a little above percent voter turnout rate. In terms of the number of people that are eligible to vote and the people who do, we've got about 220 million eligible voters in the United States. And of those, as you can see, about 120 million do. So again, low voter turnout compared to the rest of the world. We have one of the worst voter turnouts of all the democracies throughout the world. So understanding those general trends, now we're going to look at specific trends about certain demographic groups, focusing mainly on women, minorities, age-based and religion-based. If you look here, there's a noticeable gender gap that we talked about in politics, where women typically support Democrats at a much, much higher rate throughout history than they do Republicans and even independents. Men, on the other hand, although they have traditionally supported Democrats more, that gap is closing much, much more. You can see that that's a pretty close connection between Republicans and Democrats towards the end of that chart. So if you think about that, and maybe you pause and think about the gender differences between men and women, but you oftentimes see the reason that they're supporting Democrats over Republicans are for many issues. So here are some examples of some issues and then the different perspectives. And notice that in all of these, women are supporting Democrats to a much greater extent. The one with the greatest division is handling of foreign affairs. Women typically favor Democrats, which, if you understand Democrats and the liberal ideology, would be more towards diplomacy and peace talks, whereas Republicans and men would theoretically typically favor a more aggressive and militaristic approach. Race, another clear indicator about voting trends. If you look at the top chart, you see that white voters typically support the Republican Party a little bit more than they do the Democratic Party. If you look at the bottom chart, non-white voters support the Democratic Party by a huge margin from 1972 until 2008. So a huge racial gap between Democratic and Republican voters. You can see that again in this chart. If you talk about, we talked about how when gender and race collide, white men are typically supporting Romney, which is no surprise, at about 62%. White women are supporting him at 56%. So we talked about in last year's election in 2012, when white women had to choose between their whiteness or their femininity. Oftentimes they were typically voting in terms of their whiteness and following Romney's beliefs. Black men and black women are strongly Obama. Latino men and Latino women are also Obama supporters, not as strongly as African American men and women. Latino voters are on the rise. We talked about that. This is a phenomenon that is increasing number of Latino voters. It's typically viewed as being a positive for Democrats because of their beliefs and a negative for Republicans unless they change their platform in some way, shape, or form, because typically Latinos are favoring Democrats in elections from 1980 until 2012. Notice that if you see the numbers on the right here, the Democratic advantage has been very, very strong from 1980 until 2012. The strongest was 51% in 1996, but Barack Obama carried it in 2012, the Latino vote, by 44%. This chart we illustrated and talked about how this is the chart I really want to focus on down in the left-hand corner, that the GOP has still been winning converts in terms of the Latino community. Every year since 1976, in most elections, more Latinos have been favoring the GOP, although not a majority yet. And typically we talk about that's because of social issues. You see a lot, the stereotype would be that the Latino community is very religious, typically Catholic. So issues like abortion and gay marriage might be something that they support conservatives more on. But economically speaking, they would be more in favor of liberal policies. So this led us to this conversation about the Latin swing, which isn't something I'll expect you to know on the test, but just I want you to know that the Latino vote is not as black and white as sometimes it's made out to be. 31% of people in the 2012 election of Latinos voted that were under $30,000 voted for Romney. 37% that were between these incomes voted for Romney, and 46% of Latinos that were above 75% voted for, or excuse me, Bush, not Romney. So clearly indicates that all Latinos don't support the Democratic Party, but normally a large majority do. One thought that we talked about also is this idea of, when race and gender collide. Oprah Winfrey was a supporter of Barack Obama in 2007 when he was primarying against Hillary Clinton, and she took a lot of heat for that because a lot of women felt that she should have supported Hillary Clinton to try and help the first woman ever be nominated, but she had to choose between her social identities as an African American or as a woman, and decided that she would support Barack Obama. So that's the topic of race and gender when it comes to voting trends. Now we talk about the youth vote, which includes you guys in just a few years, and that's about 43 million citizens ages 18 through 30. Okay, and only 64% are registered to vote, which we'll talk about in a little bit, even though they make up 24% of the eligible voters. And that that youth vote has increased by 4.6 million in 2004, right? And it made up 17% of the electorate, so it's a really significant portion of the voters, but it typically doesn't turn out. And when it does, when the youth vote does turn out, it typically supports Democrats over Republicans. It's indicated in 2012, 18 to 24-year-olds supported Obama by 60%, 25 to 29-year-olds supported him by 60%, 30 to 39-year-olds supported Obama but by a smaller margin, and then when we hit 40, people tend to shift. 40 to 49-year-olds supported Romney by 50%, and so on and so forth. So you see that age is certainly a trend that impacts voting. Winston Churchill had a quote that I showed you that says this above: "A man who is not a socialist at 20 has no heart, and a man who is still a socialist at 40 has no head." So that is just a commentary on how age and generational politics influence voting. We talked about registration too. Not only does age impact voter turnout, but it also impacts registration. Remember, in most states you need to be registered to vote. Some states require you to be registered 20 to 25 or 30 days ahead of time. Some states have same-day registration where you can register on the day of the vote. And one state, North Dakota, doesn't even require registration. You can just show up and vote. But typically you see younger voters not being registered and then thus not turning out to vote. One law that Congress passed recently in order to help curb that was the Motor Voter Act. That's an ID that you have this unit. I want you to understand that that is a requirement that all states make it an available option for teenagers to register to vote when they receive their driver's license at the DMV. So most of you will probably get registered at that point, if not in school a little earlier, because a lot of states also allow registration where 16 and 17-year-olds can register even though they can't vote until they're 18. We talked also about how the idea that the younger generation, this paragraph here summarizes some perspectives, that it's a lazy generation, that they don't work hard, that they're too busy on social media to care about politics. And my questions to you are, is this a fair description of your generation? Are young people likely to be more politically active as they age? Are you guys going to get more engaged as a generation, or is your generation just not as committed to politics? Lastly, the idea would be that if the current political climate is making young people less political, are you ripe for de-alignment, which remember means when people break away from party affiliations and vote independent or third party, or are you ripe for even realignment, where people are switching parties due to the gridlock nature of Washington, D.C.? I also showed you this video clip, which I'm not going to play right now, but we talked about this 12-year-old girl who stood up and took on the North Carolina Congress legislative branch for passing voter ID laws that restricted the youth vote, in her opinion. The last thing we talked about is religion, and typically the more religious you are, the more you favor Republican ideals, at least especially if you are evangelical in the United States, right? Which typically is another way of referring to Protestant. So if you look over in this far right column in 2012, in a lot of instances, Obama overall took the more religious vote, but that's typically because of some really, really heavy favors of, for instance, the Jewish community favored Obama, the Hispanic Catholic community favored Obama, the Black Protestant community heavily favored Obama, but typically you see more religious groups aligning with conservative votes due to social issues. A couple exceptions, like we said, would be these, the Jewish community, the Catholic community is traditionally more often voting Democratic. So if we look at the coalitions here and looking at specifically race and religion, you can see the different coalitions here. Typically, you see Romney's largest chunk was this red here, white evangelical Protestants, and Obama's largest chunk would be these unaffiliated, right? People that are non-religious, that aren't associating with anything. Hopefully you can understand these voting trends that we talked about race, gender, age, religion, and how they typically impact, first off, whether or not someone's going to vote, and then secondly, if they do vote, who they're going to vote for. If you get these, then you're in good shape for our assessment next week. Let me know if you have any questions.